Welcome to Exchanging Notes, the interviews. Today I have the pleasure of conversing with Sylvia Fraser, the author of at least a dozen books of travel, novels, a very interesting book about the paranormal, and 50 years of journalism under her belt. And you look good for having survived 50 years of journalism.
I'll be 80 in March.
80 in March.
The only frailty I admit to is I don't hear very well. So if I look stupid when you say something to me, it may be because one, I am stupid, or two, I didn't hear.
Looking through Sylvia Fraser's work, the one thing I can tell you, and the rest she's going to have to tell you herself, that her work demonstrates a consistent and profound concern with the nature and imposition of ethos, the judgments of practical morality, and the politics resulting from working with and around those judgments. And it's all done in very fine sentences. Sylvia Fraser, thank you for dropping into Exchanging Notes.
For the invitation. And let me plunge right in.
Okay.
The Rosetta Stone to my life, and certainly to my work, is the fact that I was sexually abused by my father for about all through public school and high school. The main thing was I had completely wiped it out of my memory. At the time when I wrote the book, My Father's House, A Memoir of Incest and of Healing, even child abuse was not on the radar screen. So there was nothing in the air that would cause one to think one had been sexually abused, and certainly to have completely wiped it out. And the impulse behind all my books, beginning to end, is the story of incest, which to me was completely hidden, but was forcing its way up through my...
Now we're going to move on to your first book, 1972.
Yeah.
Published at age 37, Pandora is the story of one child from September 42 to the spring of 1945. Now, taking into consideration what you've already said about that dominating atmosphere of your childhood, it seems like a silly question to ask you, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Did the idea just spring upon you and you started writing it suddenly, or did the idea of doing Pandora nag you for a while?
None of the above.
Oh.
And all of the above. What happened was that the Star Weekly, where I had worked, was folding, as magazines were doing. And but it takes a while for a magazine to die. And I was sitting in my office and nothing much to do, so I made a shopping list of things to do. And at the bottom was write a novel. And so I sat there, I thought, oh, well. And I thought, as I spoke, feminism was coming on. This was the 70s, feminism was coming on. And I certainly thought I knew where the bodies were buried, so I was going to write 30 years in a woman's life. And I started to do this, and I started chronologically. And this material kept coming up and up and up and up and up. And it was just a swoosh of, of what I didn't know, of feelings, emotions, and memories, some very specific memories. And the manuscript, it got longer and longer and longer. I think at about page 700, I stopped numbering the pages, which you had to do manually in those days, typewriter. And I thought I must be writing. I remember looking to see what is longer, a chronicle or a saga, but it was killing me because I was in this tunnel and I could not get out. And what was happening was that when dealing with the childhood years particularly, but also the teenage years, all these memories were pushing their way up, and I was pushing them down. And the tension was, I didn't want to die, but I didn't think I could survive because it was like having my hands on a hot stove. And the interesting thing, finally what saved me was I took the first 130 pages of the book, of all this manuscript, and I turned it into about 260 pages of my book, Pandora. And I thought after I knew my true history that when I went back and read Pandora, it would be very naive. No. What I found was that I had encoded, and this is the power of the unconscious, I had encoded the true story under the, the talk of the street, the school, etc. There was the true story. I had my father had a hooked hand, and he was always menacing. Well, and I thought after I, was editing, I thought, oh, that's so phallic. That is over the top. And I tried to write it out, but it was so woven into the metaphors of the book, I couldn't get it out. There was a scene in which the bread man takes out Pandora, and he starts to molest her, and she escaped. And here's the big irony. At the time, I didn't know, I wondered as a writer, a conscious writer, if I was going to let him succeed to molest her. And I said, no, I wouldn't know how to write about a child as damaged as that. Now, that isn't irony. And another thing, in the book, my father kills my cat. That didn't happen in real life, but that was, and it took me quite a long time after my memory started to return to remember that that's how my father kept my mouth shut. That he said if I told, he would kill my cat. And since the cat was the only thing I trusted, then I refer in the book My Father's House to the child who knows as opposed to me, and that's the only vocab I can use. So the child who knows was threatened with the killing of the cat. So all this is written in the book. I couldn't believe it when I reread Pandora and saw how this was so blatantly there in so many cases.
You published My Father's House in 1987. It says on the cover, a memoir of incest and healing. Adele Wiseman said what I thought was the most interesting thing about the book. She said that it reveals how fragile both consciousness and memory are and how brutish violence can sever the self. Let me just hit you with a couple of ideas and you tell me.
Hold that question. I have to go back. The book you haven't read, Berlin Solstice.
Oh, we talked a bit about that.
No.
What else do you want to say?
No, I have to say about Berlin Solstice because it was writing Berlin Solstice that my memories came back. Okay. And it was when first of all, let me say, I started to write a book. I was very drawn to the German history. As a child, like a lot of this comes out in Pandora. But what I don't think adults realized at the time was how surrounded by war that children were. I mean, everything. I was always collecting newspapers and baskets and buying war-saving stamps. There was rationing. But our comic books were full of really, I mean, I can remember Steve Roper, and there was scenes of a woman having her hair cut off as a collaborator. And there was all this pseudo-sexuality. There was the whips of human hair and all the Nazi leather, and women were always being stripped and whipped, and it was, and this was, and I was soaking all this in as a child, and it was meaningful to me because it was too much like what was happening in my house. And so I came to a point where I was attracted to writing about that period, but I did not dare. I mean, this volatile period in which so many people have paid with their blood, with their, I couldn't dare touch it unless I went at it as, say, a journalist. So I wrote this script, or this book, novel, in which I was a journalist, and my husband was off as a submarine, he was I don't know, he was doing something underwater, and we're doing this. And I wrote this manuscript, and I gave it to publisher Jack McClelland, and he said, "This is the worst book I've ever read." And you would think that this would be discouraging, and it was, but it was only discouraging for a very short time because there was something that was pulling me there. So I threw out all the business about the journalists and everything, and I had the core of some really solid German characters that I believed in. So I did what I wouldn't have had the nerve to do, and that before, and that was I told the story from the German point of view. And I might say that my background, my father's family was German, although this was certainly not stressed when I was growing up. But it meant, I had that sort of ancestral connection. So when I came to write Berlin Solstice, so I dug into that period, and of course we have the same thing, corruption of power, and complicity, and that's where you really find it. In my, I'm not going to go into it too much, but the reasons why Germans became National Socialists are not that hard to understand if you read about the Versailles Treaty and the conditions after World War I. But it's so in a way, the appeal was kind of like separatism to Quebec at first, this nationalism, at a really hard time when there was inflation, et cetera. Okay. But the morality in my book was not if you supported the Nazis, but it was when you got out. When it became too much that you got out. And people, mostly the characters, were so deeply embedded they couldn't get out. And but why am I insisting on going back? Why did my memory come back? I started to have strange dreams, etc. And I won't go into that, but I suddenly understood. My memories came back, and I understood at the same time why I was writing the book. The classic question was, how could the Nazis do such a thing? And how could the good Germans have let them? How could my daddy have done such a thing? How could my good mummy have let him? Now that may seem very frivolous to put it that way when I'm talking about that period, but when I'm saying that if you are a child living in that situation, that is a legitimate kind of, you're completely powerless, completely unprotected. People around you, your good mother is completely complicitous. And I understood when I wrote that, when my memories then suddenly came back, I understood why I was writing the book. And that was so I could forgive my father. And in forgiving my father, I could forgive myself. So you mentioned before about guilt and complicity.
And then in 2001, you have The Rope in Water, A Pilgrimage to India, and The Green Labyrinth, exploring the mysteries of the Amazon. You said that your 3-month pilgrimage to India was a search for something larger than yourself. Why did you go look for something larger than yourself at that time?
I think it was all connected. It came out of my experiences in terms of my memories. It came out of writing the Book of Strange. I wanted a larger view. Certainly India is one of the few countries that has retained its connection to its past through hundreds, thousands of years. And I don't know if there's another country that has. And so there's that richness of the spiritual tradition, which is quite unlike ours. And, a belief in the primary aspects of consciousness, etc. And there were it was just something I wanted to explore, and I wanted it as an adventure. And the first time I went to India, I was going around the world in 1977. I didn't want to go to India, but it was kind of a long way to step over it. All I knew about India at that time, and this is all that was in there, it was poor, where people are living on the sidewalk, as if that doesn't happen in Toronto now. I thought of it as this, just this troubled country, this troubled, poor country. And I went there, and I was dazzled by its beauty, dazzled by everything about it, the landscape, the people, the traditions. Instead of chickens in the field, they had peacocks. Instead of sparrows, they had these wonderful green birds. Instead of, the wonderful deserts rolling in these golden, simmering colors, the green oasis of the tea fields. And I always thought I was going to go back, and it took me a long time to get back, but I did. But one other thing I would like to say, in talking about my writing got all the angst. I really have led quite a nice life in all sorts of ways. It's just that isn't what my writing has been about. Now, some writers are humorous. And sometimes the humor comes from a deeper place, and sometimes it doesn't. My writing served that role in my life, for which I'm grateful. And I kind of think in retrospect that the reason I chose to be a journalist was, again, it was that unconscious knowledge that someday I would be telling my secrets. The magical aspects of the whole process of remembering is that there was something inside of me that was wiser than me, that was choreographing what I remembered and when I remembered, when I needed to survive, when I was safe, started to come up, and the decisions I made as a child and how to survive, given the choices, they were wise decisions. And therapists who deal with hypnosis have come across this creature inside that knows better than you could possibly know, knows more, knows better. And so I felt this kind of inner guidance, and again, I don't know where that comes from, but again, it makes me think meaningful.